had intended to come to this earth to take on the form of a human being, to live a perfect life, to die for the sins of the world, and to establish his church as well as his kingdom. His main purpose was to establish the kingdom, and you remember that John the Baptist came along, as well as Jesus himself saying, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, or the kingdom of God is near. And so he's telling us that, that within his lifetime there's a close proximity of when the kingdom was going to be established. However, the premillennial doctrine teaches that, Jesus came in order to do that, but the Jews rejected him from being king, and so instead of him establishing his kingdom, he established the church instead. And then later down the line, way down the line somewhere, he is going to establish a physical kingdom where he'll reign on a throne in Jerusalem. Okay, and in the meantime, a number of things are going to happen. In order for this kingdom to come into place, there's got to be some signs that are going to be saying that there is a terrible time that's on the way. There's going to be a day of tribulation, or days of tribulation that are going to be almost unbearable. But before that time comes, there will be signs that will indicate that. There will be a rapture, and then where the saints are caught up. And then there's going to be a period of about 7 years, 3.5 years of tribulation, 3.5 years of great tribulation, where a number of things are supposed to happen, from the tribulation to Armageddon to those types of things. And then Jesus is going to interrupt that. He's going to come back, and he's going to establish a kingdom that will reign, and there he'll reign for 1,000 years. But I think that what we've established from the last classes is that Jesus already established his kingdom, and that when he came to this earth to establish his kingdom, the people wanted to make him a king, but they misunderstood what the king was about. They're looking for a physical kingdom, much like premillennialists look for today, a physical kingdom. But Jesus was not about a physical kingdom. His kingdom was one that transcends both heaven and earth itself. And so it's filled with spiritual blessings. And so there is a kingdom. He is the king over that kingdom. He reigns as a king, seated at the right hand of the throne of God. In Ephesians 1 and verse 20 and other passages, Colossians 3 and verse 1, and Mark 16 and 19, a bunch of passages like that, where he reigns as a king. Who are his subjects? Well, you are his subjects. You are the subjects of the kingdom, and the territory is in the hearts of men. Wherever you are, there the kingdom of God exists. So it's not one that's limited by territory or geography, but it's within each and every one of us. We are those who are priests within this kingdom. And so the kingdom already has been established, and we are now living in it. And we quoted such passages as Colossians 1, verses 13 and 14, where he says, he has transferred us out of the kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of his beloved Son. Or when John spoke about it over in Revelation chapter 1, he says, I, a fellow believer, a fellow sufferer with you, find myself in a tribulation and in the kingdom. Okay, so he was presently within the kingdom himself. And so if John was in the kingdom, say if he wrote somewhere in the 90s when he wrote the book of Revelation, then certainly the kingdom was there, and we are a part of that kingdom. One of the things that we're going to look at this morning are the signs that should come, what they say, before the rapture and the 7.5 years of tribulation, and then the kingdom being established, physically speaking, as they teach. And so we're going to look at the signs, because the signs mainly come from Matthew 24. And that's what you can kind of look like. So in addition to wrongly teaching the idea of the postponement of a kingdom being established, and in the interim, the church being established, many in the religious world, certainly since like 1839, okay, so premillennialism is a really new doctrine, take advantage of Matthew 24 and wrench, I believe, a lot of things out of its context to make it fit into their premillennial theory. They say that Matthew 24 gives us signs by which we can predict when Jesus will come again for the second time. Or Matthew 24, with its signs, have long been favorite passages of those who make predictions when the end will be. And so if you were living back in fact, as I look at the audience, all of you were living back in the early 90s. We got into it with Iraq, and how Lindsay was on a mount over in a hotel or out on a parapet overlooking the temple of the temple of the dome there on where the temple used to be, okay? And he's overlooking that, and Scud missiles are coming in from Iraq. Saddam Hussein was shooting these Scud missiles. He couldn't hit the broadside of a bomber or the thing. But anyway, he was shooting them in there. And when he was shooting it in there, that's when Hal Lindsey was saying, it's any time. These are the signs that we've been talking about. So here we are now, 20-something years later, and, So they use the signs big. I pulled this just the other day off of Facebook. And this here you see, these are the moon being turned to blood and floods and tornadoes and fires. And so this person writes in Matthew 24:8, all these are the beginning of sorrows, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, high temperatures. Where do they get high temperatures? Global warming, of course. High temperatures, wars, and plagues are spreading over more and more areas, becoming more and more serious. Little by little, the world is realizing that the Bible is not a fairy tale. Jesus is coming back. And so this person is a premillennialist. Maybe she's a dispensationalist, I don't know. But this person is saying, here are the signs that you can expect. And where do you see those signs? Well, she says they're in Matthew 24 is where you can find these. So here's the questions that we want to try to answer this morning. That is, what did Jesus mean when he did where he did mention these signs? And what was he talking about? What was the context? What is he talking about? And what about the so-called signs of the end? What are these signs of in terms of the end? So those are the questions that we're going to look at. Now, in order to do this, I've broken it down so that we can understand it easily, I think, into 10 sections. And so this morning, we're going to look at the first 5 sections, and then we'll go. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 together, and we're going to look at 10 different sections of that, okay, to explain what's going on there. The first section has to do with the occasion. By occasion, what is the context? What is going on here? Well, look at Matthew 23, if you would, because I think in order to understand it, and I think we'll see it later, to understand this, you really have to back up, because the context really begins back in chapter 20, okay? And you'll see this later on here when we set up the context of what's going on, because Jesus is in the midst of the temple, and he is in what we call the final discourses. He's having a running battle with the scribes and the Pharisees and lawyers. He's having a running discourse with these guys about different things. Well, as you back up to chapter 23 and verse 29, this will help us get to some context. Now, some of the most scathing words Jesus ever used to his audience are found right here. I mean, these are the woes, the 7 woes, and he calls the Pharisees and the scribes, he calls them a bunch of hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. I mean, it's scathing. Well, look at verse 29. It says, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murder the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the Father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the son of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. As surely I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I have wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. So he establishes a context. He's in it. He's really into it with these. He's really scathingly rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees that he calls hypocrites. And he says, you people kill the prophets. You say, our fathers, they did that, we would not. He says, yes, you will. Fill up to the full measure, because you guys will do the exact same thing. And not only that, they'll kill the Son of God. And then he says, this will all happen. This condemnation is going to come upon this generation. And then he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who stones the prophets and kills those. He's speaking of now Jerusalem. And then it says, and he walks out of the temple. And he says to his listeners, not one stone of this temple is going to be left untouched. Utter destruction is what he's talking about here. So where was Jesus when he spoke these words? Well, in order, I think, to get maybe a better understanding of it, is to back up to chapter 21. So back it with me to chapter 21. And just so you can kind of get a context of what's going on here, okay? I think it's important. Chapter 21 starts out with Jesus in his triumphant entry. He triumphantly enters into Jerusalem. He eventually will go to the temple and he will cleanse the temple, saying that you're making my Father's house a house of merchandise. Okay? So he cleanses the temple. He speaks to a fig tree, and then as you get to this section of Scripture, you start to see what's going on. He's at the temple itself. 21 verse 23. And when he had come into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing the things that things, and who gave you this authority? But Jesus answered and said to them, I will ask you one thing. So what you find out here, this is where Jesus has walked into the temple, and from here on, all the way into chapter 24, he's in the temple. Okay? So he's in the temple. Look at chapter 23 and verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chairs of Moses. Therefore, all that I tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say these things to do them. And then he talks about how they put heavy loads on people. So what he's doing is he now is in the temple, okay? And he is having running discourses with these guys. And he does so for a while. So he was teaching in the temple. He's in the temple court. That's the context that you find here that we have been reading about here. So to whom was he speaking? Well, while standing in the temple court, Jesus levels, like I said, some of the harshest and most condemning words he ever spoke about to Jewish leaders, and he's speaking it to the multitudes. And then in chapter 23, he gives these 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. So his audience is the multitude, but his condemnation is directed at the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the Pharisees that he calls hypocrites. He says, you guys are two-faced. You say one thing and you do another. You talk about being, about being strict with the law, but you guys don't even do it yourselves. But you bind heavy loads upon people that's too hard for them to bear. You yourselves won't bear it, but you expect others to bear it. So he has some really, like I said, some extremely harsh words that he shares with these people. Specifically, what does he accuse them of in verses 29 through 32 that we read just a few moments ago? Well, he says, you're like your forefathers. Rejecting and shedding the blood of God's prophets, and that they are doing the exact same thing, including killing the greatest prophet of all. Not only have you killed the prophets, you'll continue to do so. And not only that, but they will kill him. And they won't stop there. Because remember, Paul, in his missionary journeys, remember how the Jewish leaders, they kept following him from place to place. And he was beaten, times without number, with rods, with whips, stoned, left for dead. I mean, and it didn't end there. It happened to all these guys. There's this shedding that's going on here that Jesus predicts in chapter 29 and following. So what does Jesus say will happen as a result of what they have done and are going to do? What's going to happen? Well, he says in verse 32, he says, you are filling up the measure of your own guilt because you're just like your ancestors. So remember, they said, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have done that. And Jesus said, oh, yes, you would. And not only that, you will. So he says, so fill up the full measure of God's wrath, because that's what's going to come upon you. You know, have done terrible things. You're going to do even more terrible things. So he says, so fill up the measure. Just keep on adding to this, because when justice comes, it will be meted out fairly. So it shouldn't be a surprise to you. So upon whom does he say this action will come? Well, look at verse 36 of chapter 23. Notice what he says. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon what? This generation. So now he's put a time marker on it. He's put a time marker on it. And that time marker on, he says, this is going to happen during this generation. It's not going to happen 1,000 years down the line. It's not going to happen 2,000 years down the line. He says, what's going to happen is going to come upon this generation. That's important, okay? That's important. It's an important time marker. I'll show you another one in a little bit. So what destruction does Jesus predict here? What destruction does Jesus predict here? We've read it, so. Yeah, he says it's going to come upon Jerusalem. And what else? Not only on Jerusalem, but what else? The temple, okay? So remember, he says in chapter 24, verse 2, Jesus said, see, they're walking out of the temple. We'll see this later on in Luke, because I think it's a little bit more definitive. But they're walking out of the temple. If you had been living in that day and you had seen Herod's temple was incredible. Herod's temple was much, much larger than Solomon's temple. And Solomon's temple was pretty amazing. But it was destroyed too, okay? And then Herod rebuilds the temple. And when Herod built it, I've been to Israel. If you've been there and seen the things that Herod the Great did, Herod the Great was an incredible when it came to architecture and engineering. And anyway, he rebuilds the temple. And it is absolutely gorgeously beautiful, ornate. And so the disciples are walking out of the temple, and Jesus said, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those I have sent to you. He says, behold, your house is left to you desolate. And they're walking out of the temple, and they're going, wow, Lord, look at this temple. This is amazing. This is beautiful. And Jesus says, surely I say to you that not one stone will be left upon another. When? Well, in this generation. So where is Jesus when he makes the prediction? Well, he's in the temple. What destruction is he talking about? In verse 37, he's talking about Jerusalem. So when the Romans encircled Jerusalem in 70 AD, they'll take months to conquer Jerusalem. They won't just walk into Jerusalem. They will fight inch for inch to take Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a walled city, and they're going to pay dearly to get into the city. I mean, pay dearly. A lot of Romans are going to die. And the Romans, they're not used to that. And so when they finally breach the walls and get into the city, it is a bloodletting. It's been said in history books that the streets ran deep with blood. That wasn't figurative. They estimate that over 1 million people were killed once the Romans breached the walls and got into the walls. And when they went in, they killed people. I mean, they massacred them. And the streets literally did run with blood down the gutters, okay? And when they got to the temple, they completely decimated it. I mean, they burned it. How can you burn rocks? Well, if you think about the temple being laid with gold, they burned everything. So when they burned it, the gold ran and got into the crevices or into the cracks and the seams of the stones that were laid upon one another. So they dismantled them so they could get all the gold out of them. So that's why these stones are being cast over the side and down. Anyway, they took Jerusalem, kicked all the Jews out, and then they just completely destroyed the temple. So what destruction does Jesus predict here in verse 24, verses 1 and 2? Well, what place is Jesus stepping down from? He's stepping out of the temple. He's been in the temple court now from chapter 21 and following. He's been in the temple court. He is done speaking with these guys. He steps down out of the temple, and that's when the disciples mention the grandeur of the temple, and that's when Jesus tells them that, there's going to be a destruction here. So what place are the disciples pointing out? Well, they're pointing out the temple. That's what they're talking about. Okay? That's what they're talking about. What destruction does Jesus predict in verse 24 and verse 2? What place is he talking about? This is redundant, isn't it? I just want this to sink way into your heads. Okay? That's why I'm doing this. The temple. What does Jesus say is going to happen to it? Destruction. It's going to be gone. By the way, when Titus Vespasian, when he came into Jerusalem and leveled Jerusalem and leveled the temple, guess what has never come back since? The temple. Now there's a Jewish mosque up on top of the thing. Okay, that's on the thing, but it never came back. So after the destruction of Jerusalem and Rome pushed all the Jews out of Jerusalem, a lot of them ran. Well, actually, they did probably during the Maccabean Wars too, but they ran to the north up to Nazareth into Galilee. That's where a lot of them went, but they were kicked out. It was an utter and complete destruction of Jerusalem. And not only were they kicked out, but the Jewish people, they lost all their bloodlines. They didn't know who the Levites were any longer. They could not identify a chief priest, still can't. So they're not able to identify the bloodlines of the Levites, which means they cannot identify the bloodlines of a chief priest, which means what happens to their sacrificial system? Sacrificial system goes down the tubes because they can't identify who their tribes are, and especially the tribe of Levi, who were the priests, who conducted all the sacrifices. So when they talk about in the future there being a temple replaced upon where the temple used to be, and the sacrificial will start again, how are they going to identify the Levites? And the answer is they can't because they don't know who they are, so they're just going to have to just pick some guy, or some guys. So that's how devastating this destruction is going to be. And so it's going to be a destruction of Judea or Judaism as a nation and as a religion, but especially as a religion. It's going to devastate it. So remember the context as we move on, okay? They're on they move to the Mount of Olives. So look at chapter 24 once again. Jesus said to them, they're standing in the shadow of the temple, do you not see all these things? As surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. I think some of your translations says, see to it that no one leads you astray. Mark that word in your mind, okay? Leads you astray or deceives you. So they're on the Mount of Olives. Now Luke, and I think maybe Mark say that Peter, James, and John come to Jesus privately, and then they ask him some questions. They asked him to tell us more about this. You said that the temple there's not going to be one stone left upon another there. How could that possibly be? Tell us more. And so what is Jesus' response to them in verse 4? Take heed that no one deceives you. So that's his response to them, and that brings us to section 2, which is questions. So the first one is establishing the context. Okay, this is the questions. So verse 3, they ask him several questions. They ask, number 1, when will these things be? 2, what will be the sign of your coming? 3, and the end of the age. 3 questions that are asked there in that single verse. 3 questions. When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So when will these things be? What things? When will Jerusalem be destroyed? That's the context. When will Jerusalem be destroyed? When will the temple be destroyed? And then the next question, what will be the sign of your coming? 3, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So we're going to try to answer some of those questions. To do that, turn over to Luke chapter 21. Luke 21. And I want you to notice what he says in verses 5 and 6. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are looking at, days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down." And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things be, and what will be the sign of these things that are about to take place?" Okay, so that's the parallel. That is a parallel to Matthew 24. Look at Mark 16 now. Mark 13, sorry. Mark 13. As he was going out of the temple, this is another parallel. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" What things are going to be fulfilled? The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is what he's saying. And Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. See to it that no one leads you astray. See to it that no one deceives you." So, what's the subject of the context of both these sections? Destruction of Jerusalem and the temple again. Okay, it's a parallel account. Okay, and so all they've done is they've added each writer has added a few things. Mark and Luke, they add to it, "See all these precious joins and these votive gifts. Look how beautiful this place is," And Jesus says, "Look at this place. There's not one building here that's going to be left with one stone upon another." So in both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have parallel accounts of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, and you have timelines that are put there. So taking all these versions of the questions into account, how would you word the two things the disciples wanted to know about? Well, when will these things come about? What things? When will these things come about this temple coming down and these buildings coming down and Jerusalem? What signs would tell them when the event was about to happen? When will these signs be? That is, your coming and the end of the age. So when will this be that this stuff is going to be torn down? What will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the end of the age? That's what they're wanting to know about. So it's not difficult to imagine that in the minds of these apostles, the destruction of Jerusalem and the casting down of the temples, huge stones, would be a calamity which they could well refer to as the end of the age. It's the end. It's the end of everything that they've known in terms of Judaism. So that's what he's talking about. The end of the age is the end of Judaism. It's coming to an end. Today, you have the Hasidic Jews over in Israel, the Orthodox Jews, who are very, you have to admire their commitments and their convictions, okay? But they talk about keeping the law. There's no way they can possibly keep the law because the law centered around a sacrificial system. And that sacrificial system pointed to a Messiah. That's what that was all about. It was a tutor, an instructor moving them toward the Messiah that had been promised as a seed promise to Abraham in Genesis, the 12th chapter. So you can imagine what the disciples are thinking. They're coming out of this beautiful temple and this walled city, and they're saying, how could this possibly be? To them, it was going to be an end. So you see that. Now, here's the other critical boundary that I want you to see. So remember, back in Matthew 23, he says, "This will come upon this generation." Okay, now look at Matthew 24 and verse 34, because this is a marker that I think is important. Verse 32 says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not. No, by no means pass away. So verse 34 is important. Assuredly, I say to you, what? This generation will by no means pass away till they see all these things take place. What things? Well, all the way from chapter 23 and verse 29 to verse 34, everything in between is going to take place. Or if you want to say from Matthew 24 to verse 4 to 34, he says everything in between here and here are going to take place during this generation. So when people try to say, well, the generation, he's not really talking about the generation. He's talking about down the line. It's bigger than that. Well, in the Greek word for generation is genea. It means a generation, contemporaries, a period of age or time. It's a race of people. That's what he's talking about, okay? So he's not talking about two different things, okay? He's talking about something that's immediate that are contemporary with one another. So what time limit is Jesus proposing? Well, by Jesus identifying this generation, he says that all the things I have described prior to verse 34 will be done. Thus, all the events described in verses 4 to 33 will happen during the lifetime of people of the generation alive in Jesus' day. Yeah. Yep, all that's going to happen. But understand something here, okay? This is what we're getting ready to get into down the line here, and I'll explain it verse by verse as we go. Is he's used a lot of apocalyptic literature here, a lot of literature. He's using a lot of terminology. To us is strange to us, but to them would be very understanding in terms of things like moons being turned to blood and that kind of stuff. And I'll explain that to you because you'll see that even in Acts, the 2nd chapter, when this is what the prophet Joel said. And then he'll talk about a lot of things that seem otherworld, okay? But he's talking about the Holy Spirit coming upon people, upon the apostles. So everything from verse 4 to verse 33 says this is going to happen in this generation. I didn't make the timeline, by the way. Jesus did. So he says everything before that is going to happen. And it's going to happen in this generation, not in this generation. Okay. So it's absolutely clear in every case that the context makes it clear or absolutely certain that Jesus was speaking of those he has been addressing those alive in the first century. So he's not talking about something down the line. So he says it's going to happen in this generation and in Matthew 23, and then it's going to end by 34. Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, it's gone in terms of the Judaistic system that was once there. Yeah. Yeah, it's gone. It's scattered. Section 3, preliminary and possible misleading events. What general subject is under discussion here? Well, false signs of a coming destruction of Jerusalem. With what warnings does Jesus introduce the list of events? With verse 4, he says, see to it that no one leads you astray. I'm getting ready to tell you some things, but make sure you're not led astray. See to it no one deceives you. See to it that you're not misled. That's what he says in verse 4. And given this list, then, Jesus is giving signs by which we can predict when the end of the world is coming. Well, no, he's not talking about that. He's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of Judaism. He's talking about the end of Jerusalem. It's going to be destroyed. He's talking about the temple being dismantled. Does Jesus intend the list to give signs by which the disciples could tell when Jerusalem was soon to be destroyed? The answer to that is no. Because he says, I'm going to give you some signs, but this is not the end of things, it's the beginning of birth pangs. But there is one sign that you can be sure of when it happens that you will not be able to miss. So Jesus then gives this list of events rather than to warn the disciples not to be fooled into thinking such events could be used as signs to predict the coming end of Jerusalem. That is super important because look again at Matthew 24, okay? Matthew
24. Jesus answered said to them, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will be delivered you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because of the lawlessness will abound, love for many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached into all the world as witnesses to all nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy places, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So he gives a list of signs that he says, what's going to happen? The destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of the world, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. Now look at Matthew 24 and verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, keep that in your head, and then turn over to to Luke chapter 21, and notice verse 20 and 21. He says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the midst of the city depart, and let not those who are in the country enter the city." So, what is the real sign? He says, you're going to have people come saying, the Messiah is right over here. He's in this room. He's right there. Or he says, there's going to be signs. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be famines and earthquakes and different things, natural disasters. There's going to be those things. He goes, but that's not the end. So what is the real sign that they should know to get out? Yeah, he says, when you see in Matthew, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation on the way, you need to get out of the city. Luke says, when you see the armies surround the city, the army he's talking about is Titus's Roman army. He surrounds the city. By the way, he didn't just take Jerusalem. He takes cities all along the way. But he gets to Jerusalem, he says, and when you see that sign, that's the sign. These others are not the signs. Don't let people deceive you by saying wars and rumors of wars and tornadoes and earthquakes and famines and all that stuff. That's not what you need to worry about. That's not the sign. The sign you need to look for is when you see the armies coming. When you see the armies surround the city, that's when you know the city's going down. That's when you know the temple's going down, and that's when you as Christians, you need to get out of the city. You need to flee. Okay, so you heard this word, abomination of desolation. Who in the world, what is an abomination of desolation? Well, when Daniel talked about the abomination of desolation, Daniel was talking about the Seleucid army coming in. When Alexander died, the Greek Empire was intact, but they came to him and said, who's going to succeed you? And he said, the tradition is whoever's the strongest. And then he talks about 4 generals, and the 4 generals divide up the empire. And one of the generals that divides up the empire is of the Seleucids. And he comes into Jerusalem. He attacks Jerusalem. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And he is known as the abomination of desolation. And the reason why he is known this way, you can see this in Daniel 9 and verse 27, the reason why he is known in this way is because in 167 BC, he stopped all Jewish sacrifices. He entered the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. He set up a statue of Zeus in the altar, burnt sacrifice outside the temple. He sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. He was the abomination of desolation that causes desolation. So the Jews, they know, when Jesus uses this word, the abomination of desolation, they know their history. They're going to go right back. Boom. They're going to go right back to Antiochus Epiphanes, and they're going to know what he's talking about. When I was in school, I did a study on the little horn of Daniel. And in the little horn of Daniel is the 11th horn. And I remember writing in the paper, I identified Antiochus Epiphanes for that age, but I also said that maybe he's be talking futuristic in terms of Tiberius, who's over the armies of Rome when they go into Jerusalem in 70 AD. So as we I guess we'll finish up next week. When we get into it, just remember keeping everything prior to verse 34 in its context. Because that's what Jesus said. Jesus said, the temple and everything's going to be, your generation is going to, when it's happened. And then he puts the other time marker at the other end in verse 34 says, none of these things that I've talked about from verse 3 to 33 is going to happen, or it's going to happen within that box, within that generation. So he's not talking about future generations. He's talking about the then and now. Okay. Next week, we'll kind of explain all the stuff in between. All right. Thank you. Hope you're not completely confused.